Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our session, Recent Trends in International Trade and Firm Organization. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mrs. Dalia Marin, to open the session. Mrs. Dalia Marin, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Welcome to this session, Recent Trends in International Trade and Firm Organization. We have 3 papers in this session, and I would like to tell the audience to use the Q&A or the chat function of Zoom in case you want to ask questions or in case you want to give comments, and I will read it loud to whoever is concerned. So we start with Esteban Rossi Hansberg from Princeton University. Esteban, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, so thanks for including this paper in the program. This is joint work with Ezra Werfield, Pierre Daniel Sartre, and Nico Trachter, and it's called Plants in Space. And the idea is to try to think about one of the fundamental problems of firm organization and one of the key problems that firms face when deciding how to produce, which is how many plants to build or have, what's the size of these plants, and where exactly to locate them. And the trade-offs, of course, that govern this decision are fairly straightforward. On one hand, you want to be close to your customers to minimize transport costs. On the other hand, you want to minimize the fixed cost of setting up more plants and reduce managerial cost of managing many plants at the same time. And so there's this problem of plants cannibalizing each other if they are too close. And so you want to kind of avoid that, but at the same time reduce transport costs. And so this problem is a problem that it's important, but at the same time we don't have kind of general insights on this problem. So that's what we're going to try to tackle in this paper. And of course, it's important to have the solution to this problem because it determines what type of product customers have access to. It determines the productivity of these firms. It determines, their marginal cost and overall kind of levels of concentration in the economy, etc. So there's many aspects that depend on this kind of basic core underlying problem of the firm. Now, so if we take a look, or we look at a particular example of how firms set up plants in space, think about Starbucks, for example. So Starbucks has many stores, as we all know. In particular, in the US, it had about 14,000 stores in 2014. And if we look at, different areas, so here I have Princeton, Richmond, and New York, the density of stores, of course, varies tremendously depending on where you are. There's high density of stores in New York, much less in Richmond, which is kind of a medium-sized city in the US, and then Princeton, which is a smaller town. It's smaller, and so you could think, well, yes, of course, that the density of plants is just following the density of population, but there's a lot of variation in the size of these plants as well, or the size of these stores, or in this case, coffee shops as well, where in New York, they are quite a bit bigger, for example, than in Richmond. And so, one tendency could be to say, well, in some sense, the basic solution to this problem is simply the more productive firms, the firms that have more plants, they set up more plants everywhere. Right, so they set up more plants in the densest places, and they are the ones that reach the more marginal markets. And there's many theories out there that would have this type of implications. Now, when you look at in a little bit more detail at the data, you see that that's not quite right. What emerges is a form of sorting. And so here is, to illustrate that, is consider 2 pharmacies in the US, Walgreens and Rite Aid. Walgreens is the larger one, the ones that has more plants. And so I'm going to call it the more productive one. And what you have here is the cumulative number of plants ordered relative to the population density of those locations. And what you see is that the smaller firm, in this case Rite Aid, which is the gray bars in the graph, actually has more stores in the lower density places. Namely, it's not that the more productive firm has more stores everywhere. Actually, in the less dense places, is the less productive one that has more stores. So they are sorting, these two firms are sorting on where to put their plants. And the more productive one is putting more plants in the more higher density places, and the less productive one seems to be putting more plants in the low density places. And so that's a way of organizing the location of these firms that involves sorting. They are sorting across space. And so we want to try to understand these type of patterns and kind of build a theory to understand these patterns. So what do we do in the paper? Where we start by proposing a model of firm location decisions, introduce the basic forces that I talked about. We're going to have heterogeneous firms that are going to locate many plants across heterogeneous locations. They're going to face transport costs. They're going to have span of control costs. So it's going to be costly to set up many plants, and there's going to be fixed costs of setting those plants. And so that's going to give us all these trade-offs that I was talking about. They want to minimize transport costs, but they want to also reduce cannibalization across plants. Now, how are we going to tackle this? This is a very hard problem in general because it's a large combinatorial problem that gets out of hand once you have a relatively large number of locations. It doesn't actually have to be that large. And so what we're going to propose as a solution for this complicated problem is what I'm going to call a tractable limit. It's a limit in which we're going to change this cost in a way that I'll specify in a minute, that is essentially going to make the problem of the firm a local problem, and that's going to allow us to analyze it in a relatively simple way using some of the insights of the old central place theory and discrete geometry. And with that, we're going to provide a particular, substantive insight, which is that the span of control cost actually are going to lead to this sorting pattern that I described before. And I'm going to give you at the end some evidence, some more systematic evidence that sorting pattern is in fact in the data. Okay, so let me skip the literature review given that this is a short presentation. Okay, so the environment is, think about space. We're going to think about a unit square in space, but I mean, this is kind of really arbitrary. Each location I'm going to denote by S, and there's going to be some local exogenous characteristic that is B in each location S, and then there's a residual demand that the firm is going to face in those locations. There's going to be a level of that demand that I'm going to denote by DS. And then, we're going to think about like a constant elasticity, where the elasticity is governed by this parameter epsilon. Okay, and then there's a local wage at which firms or local plants can hire workers, which is this WS, and a commercial rent that the firm has to pay in order to rent space to set up plants, that is given by RS. Okay, and the firm is going to take the local equilibrium as given. So all of that is the firm is a price taker in that sense. So firms are going to produce a particular variety that I'm going to denote by J. And the problem of the firm then is to set up plants in the different locations in that unit square, and the set of choices of what locations to set up plants in, I'm going to denote by O. J. Okay, so O is that decision of where exactly to locate plants, and N of J then is the number of plants that the firm sets. Okay, so OJ is exactly where, N of J is kind of the measure in some sense of that set, which is the number of plants. Now the firm productivity then is, well, if the firm is deciding to produce or is producing in a particular location O, right, that is the part of the set of locations where it's producing, well, it gets the local productivity BO, and then it has this extra term in its productivity, which is the Z. So Z has two components. The first component, the QJ, is an idiosyncratic firm productivity, as in your standard Mellitz model or heterogeneous firm model. And then the second one depends on the set of plans that the firm sets up. So depending on how many plans you set up, your productivity is going to vary. And this is exactly the span of control cost. The fact that if you set up many plans, you need managers, or that takes attention of the manager, etc. And so you're going to be less productive in all your different plans. Of course, setting up more plans also helps you in reducing transport costs, etc. But it costs you in terms of span of control. And then for each plan, you have to rent psi units of commercial real estate at the local price. And then you need to reach consumers, and that's going to depend on distance according to some iceberg trade costs or iceberg cost of transport costs of reaching your customers that depends on the distance to them, delta. Okay, so that's really the setup of the problem. Okay, so that's the setup. And so the firm, what's the problem of the firm? The firm essentially has three main decisions to make, right? So the first one is conditional on where you have the plans. You have to decide how to serve your customers, from which plan to serve your customers. Then I'm going to call that the catchment area of the firm. The second decision is a pricing decision. At what price are you going to sell your product to customers in a particular location? And then the third problem, and the more complex problem, is where exactly to set up all those plans, okay? And so once you put it all together, you have, this is the problem of how to serve customers conditional on where your plans are. So namely, you are minimizing the cost of serving a customer conditional on where your plans are. What is that? Well, you have to pay the wage, you have to pay the transport cost, and this is your productivity of serving it from a particular plan. Then the prices solve the second problem, and once you put it all together, you need to decide, well, where do I locate my plans so as to maximize these profits? What are these profits? Well, it's the profit that you get from selling to all these locations, conditional on serving customers from the right places, and after you pay all the fixed costs of setting up all your plans. Okay, so this is the whole problem. This problem is very complicated. Essentially, why? Because this OJ object is very high dimensional. Okay, so now let's think about the first optimization problem there. So the first optimization problem is the catchment area. So how do you decide how to serve a customer conditional on where your plans are? And just to give you an example of that, suppose we have a particular transport cost function here, which is just 1 plus distance, all right? If you have that in the unit square and all your plans have exactly the same productivity, in this case 1, then the catchment areas are very simple. They are just the squares that you see on in the graph on the left. Okay, so in that case, these catchment areas are simple. Suppose I do a slight modification to this and I say, well, no, the plans here in the diagonal don't have the same productivity. These two ones are a little bit more productive. Instead of 1 are 1.2, and this one in the corner is a little bit less productive because of some particular characteristics of that location or anything you can think of. Then the resulting catchment areas are the areas that are depicted there, and you can see how complicated that can already be, right? Just choosing how to serve customers from the different plans becomes quite a difficult problem. Now, if on top of that you are deciding how many and where exactly to locate them, that becomes kind of an impossible problem. And that's why we don't have general insights that we can use to think about, the impact of different forces and the importance of different forces in general for this problem. And so what's our approach? Our approach is going to say, well, take a particular limit where all these trade-offs are still relevant, but are all operating at the local level. And so that's kind of the conceptual trick, in some sense, to be able to crack this problem and make some analytical progress on it. And so the way we're going to do it is we're going to take a limit when delta goes to 0. And what is delta is we're going to index the cost of setting plans, the transport cost, and the span of control cost all to delta. And so as delta goes to 0, we're going to make the fixed cost of setting plans go to 0. We're going to make the span of control cost go to 0 as well. And we're going to make transport costs go to infinity. And so what does that do? This is all going to 0 or going to infinity at a particular rate that keeps this relevant trade-offs, namely the cannibalization, the fact that transport costs are important, the span of control, all of those trade-offs stay relevant, but they are all operating at the local level, right? And so once that's true, that complicated problem that I just alluded to becomes a much simpler problem. And that's what this is the core result in the paper. This is our core proposition, that problem that I showed you before, in this limit when delta goes to 0, becomes the profits that you get from solving that problem converge to the profits that you get from this problem here. And what is this problem? What this problem is a much simpler problem. It's a problem where you're only deciding the density of plants that you have in the different locations, okay? And because it's only the density of plants, right? We can solve this problem as a standard calculus of variations problem. So you can take first order conditions and analyze your first order condition and do your standard, the standard way in which you would solve it. And so why does this work? Why can we take that limit and do that? Essentially because in the limit, when we're thinking about, narrow locations, the catchment area, the problem of solving this catchment area problem becomes much simpler because at the local level, space is like homogeneous space, and the old spatial theorists already told us that if you have a homogeneous space, the optimal catchment area is always a hexagon, because hexagons are kind of in between, you're close to the plant, but you can fill space without overlaps, okay? And so at the local level, and so at the end of the day, once you take that limit, everything is hexagons at the local level, and so you can solve that problem of the catchment area, and once you solve that problem of the catchment area, that simplifies the problem and becomes a problem in which you're essentially only deciding on the density of these different places. And the key function then becomes this local efficiency of distribution function, which depends on the area of a hexagon, etc. But essentially it's a concave function that tells you, well, as I put more plants in a particular location, I gain efficiency of distribution because I'm relatively closer to my customers and transport costs matter, but it's concave, namely if I put many plants, eventually get less and less from it. Why? Because of this cannibalization. Okay, and so that's the trade-off that these firms are going to face. And so you take this problem then, which is given in the first equation. Now I can take first order conditions, and this is the first order condition with respect to the number of plants in a particular location, n, little n. Okay, and so what is this problem? This tells me, well, there is like a profitability of the location, the productivity of the firm, and then how this efficiency of distribution changes. This is kind of the benefit of putting another plant in a given location. What's the cost? The cost is, well, I have to pay the rent, and there is another fixed cost here, lambda. And what is that other fixed cost? Is that it's an endogenous fixed cost that comes out of the span of control effect on productivity, which is, well, whether I want to put another plant or not, or the cost of putting another plant in a particular location depends on how many plants I already have, because if I put another plant there, that affects my span of control, and that affects the productivity of all my production plants. And so the firm has to take that into account. Okay, and so this is going to be a firm specific object that is going to depend on the configuration of where the firm has its different plants. And that acts essentially as another fixed cost for putting a plant in another location. So that comes directly out of solving this problem that I just showed you. And from there, you can draw the following conclusion, which is kind of one of the core substantive implications of the paper. Now, the first thing that you can show is under some regularity conditions that larger firms are going to have these larger lambdas. So namely, that extra fixed cost that I was just talking about is going to be larger for larger firms. Why? Because for those firms, if you lower the productivity of all of these plants because you increase span of control costs, that's really bad for very large firms. Okay, so in that sense, large firms are going to have this extra fixed cost of setting up another plant. And so that's going to actually lead to this sorting that I was talking about. And so if you focus on the graph at the bottom here, what's going to happen is that the high productivity firms are going to have a higher lambda, and that's going to imply that they are going to go more and they're going to set up more plants in the high rent locations. So in these locations here, while the less productive firm or the low productivity firm is going to set up more plants in the low rent locations, which are also, you know, in equilibrium going to be the less dense locations. And so why is that? Why do we get that? Which is kind of a very different implication than what you get in virtually all of these models. That mostly say that the more productive firms are just going to reach more places. Why is that the case here? It's coming from this lambda that I emphasized before, the fact that that lambda is larger for larger firms. And so that what that means is that rents or the characteristics of the location, how costly the local costs, are less important for the firm when deciding how many plants to set up in a particular location than this span of control cost. So for the very productive firm, rents are less important, and what matters is that you're affecting the span of control cost. While for less productive firms, they don't really care about the span of control cost because they don't have that many plants, right? In the limit, if you only have one plant, you don't care at all about it, right? But you do care about rent, okay? And so the small firms, they care a lot about rent in terms of the fixed cost that they are setting up plants. While on the other hand, the very productive firms, they care a lot about the span of control, right? And so in very high rent locations, the issue is the rent. The rent is high. And so the low productivity firms really care about that. They don't tend not to go there, while the high productivity firms, they do go there, right? Because rent in some sense is a smaller fraction of their fixed cost. Okay, so that's the argument in this that I had in this slide. And so that gives you this sorting by which firms, high productivity firms tend to go to the more productive places. So this is kind of an illustration where if you put it in the computer, so what I have here is kind of an industry equilibrium and equilibrium in one particular industry organized in the x-axis locations by their income, right? And I'm illustrating the presence of the firms in the different locations for three different set of firms. The equilibrium is calculated for many, for a whole distribution of firms, but I'm just showing you three particular ones. And very productive firms, which is the black, intermediately productive firms, which is the dark blue, and then the less productive ones that are the light blue. Okay, and so you can see how in the model, the dark line, the high productivity firms, they are in more places, right? They are not in the less productive places. The intermediate ones are in, the less productive places, but not in the top productive places. So that's exactly the sorting that we were talking about. And the least productive plants are only in the low income places. Okay, and sales kind of reproduce that. And just as an example for you to kind of understand what we now can do with this type of model is, suppose now I change the span of control costs, okay, and I reduce the span of control costs. So say, if you want a context, say because of improvements in communication technology, right? So if improvement in communication technology allow managers to manage more plants, what would the model imply in terms of the location of these plants across locations, across space? And so here you see it, the dashed lines are with the lower span of control costs. And so you can see how, the top firms, they expand in space, they go to more locations, in particular, now they go to the the lower income places. The medium ones do the same, right? They also go to the expand in the low income places, right? In fact, you can see how the top firms actually have now less plants in the top places because they face more competition from kind of firms that are a little bit less productive than them. And what happens to the very low productivity firms in this case? They just exit. So you see how the sorting happens and how changes in these costs, and you could do a similar exercise, for example, with transport costs, how that is going to affect where these different firms locate. And this sorting, again, is essential to think about that. So, Dalia, maybe a couple of minutes more? One, okay, thank you. The last part of the paper, we present some evidence for all of this, that it's a little bit more systematic. It all uses this NETS data set for 2014, which is data from Dun & Bradstreet. The spatial area we organize by, you divide the US by squares of certain number of miles, M by M, where M can vary from, I think we varied from 12 miles to 48 miles. And then, firm productivity is monotone with the total employment of the firm. So that's going to be in the model. And so that's going to be our marker for how productive these firms are, or the proxy for how productive these firms are, and population density for the characteristics of the location. Okay. And so the first evidence that I want to show you is this graph, and probably I'll stop here given the time. So this shows you the total firm employment. So you can think about this as like the firm productivity, if you will. And then on the y-axis, what I have is the average density in the places where the firm has plants. Okay? And so what you can see is that there's a very clear positive relationship in the data, right? So namely, firms that are larger are in denser places, are present in denser places. Think about the standard model gives you exactly the opposite, right? It tells you because the large firms reach more marginal places in the standard model, this curve is exactly the opposite, it's downward sloping, right? But in the data, it's very clearly upward sloping, which tells you, which is exactly the sorting result that I was telling you about. And you can, do it for different cuts of industries and firms, for the ones that have many plants, etc. Controlling for headquarters. You can do many things to show that's in fact in the data. And we do many other tests in the paper, but let me stop there given the lack of time. So just to summarize, the problem of how many, the size, and where to locate plants, it's of course a core problem of firms. As economists, we would love to be able to solve that problem in a clear and concise way. It's a very complicated combinatorial discrete choice problem. We don't know how to solve it. And so we need, in order to make analytical progress, we need to simplify the problem in ways that don't throw away the key trade-offs that we want to analyze. And what this paper does is proposes a way to do that. Keep the basic trade-offs and be able to analyze the problem with our standard calculus of variations tools. You do that, that leads to some insights, in particular the importance of sorting and span of control that seem to be there in the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good timing. We don't have questions from the audience, but I have a question. If you move to the empirics, do you have a way of measuring this lambda that you talked about, that is larger for the large firms? Because that's basically driving it. The lambda is the driving force for the pattern you showed at the beginning in the figure, why the big firms are not in the low density locations.
Right. So that's a great question. And so one way to do it is to implement that first order condition exactly, right? So from that first order condition, you can in principle back out that lambda conditional identifying the other things. And so in order to the other objects of that first order condition. So what are the other objects of that first order condition? Are these efficiency of distribution, the marginal efficiency of distribution, and then the productivity of the firm. So we in principle, all of that can be estimated, and that would give you a particular value of the lambda for a particular firm. Another way of doing that, and in particular establishing the ranking of the lambdas, is exactly what I was doing, which is, well, what is the values of lambdas that would give you the sorting pattern that we are seeing here, right? And so that would give you the relationship between firm productivity and lambda, which is really what you want, right? What you want is, to what extent does that lambda J actually vary with firm productivity? That's really the question that you want to answer. And that question, in some sense, in principle, you can back out from the slope of that line that I show you. And so the first thing that you see is that that lambda is very much increasing in firm productivity, and you know that leads to the particular sorting that we have. So it's the combination of both, right? That the model, in some sense, has the lambda in the right place, is not multiple, right? And that it's increasing in firm productivity. So in some sense, it's validating both, and from there you could back it out. But that would be like an indirect method of backing out. Yeah. So you can use the first order condition as an estimated equation and do it directly, or back it out from the model through that relationship that I showed. Right.
Thank you. I don't see more questions, so we move to the second paper. Originally, Thierry Mayer was supposed to present it, but Kate Heath is now from the University of British Columbia is going to present their joint paper. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen. So this paper is joint with Thierry Mayer and Mark Melitz, and I think there's some strong relations to what Esteban is talking about, because we're also interested in thinking about plants and their locations in space, but we're taking those locations in space as given, and then thinking about how they decide who to source from is the big question we're working with here. Now, the sort of one way of thinking about this paper is that the free trade agreements that have been proliferating through the world in the last decades are both a boon and a bane for firms that are trying to build global value chains. On the one hand, the boon side is that you can get parts that you need from all over the place based on their comparative advantages, and bring them in tariff-free. The bane is that in order to get that tariff-free qualification, you need to satisfy often onerous rules of origin. And even worse, in the process of using all these inputs, you may make the thing that you're making from these imported inputs not qualify for the rules of origin in the region where you most want to sell it. So you may lose the advantages in effect. And so that's what we have in mind when we say that restrictive content rules can backfire. They can make a place less attractive. So what I want to try and do today, quickly, in the time frame, is first talk about a model we have where we use the properties of a continuum model that comes out of Eaton Cortum and has been used by Antitrust Court, Tensile Knots, to draw some simple conclusions about this problem, to sort of help us think about the problem, and then move into an actual empirical work where we have really detailed data about this sourcing problem that will allow us to conduct counterfactuals of how rules actually distort decision making. And the thing that we won't really do is link those two things back together particularly closely, because that's sort of on the to-do list of how we can wed those two separate parts of the paper more closely. So one key idea, the first half of the paper, is the idea of the rule of origin Laffer curve. And so the original Laffer curve was drawn on a cocktail napkin in Washington, D.C. around 1980. And the tax rate was on the x-axis, and on the y-axis was the total amount of tax revenue that was brought in. This is pretty important if you're my age, because it launched Reaganomics. And it was pointed out in this cocktail bar that there would be no revenue if the tax rate was 0, and no revenue if the tax rate was 100%. But in between, there would be a maximum. We don't know exactly where we want to be. That's a judgment call. But one thing we know we don't want to be is to the right of the peak of the Laffer curve, because in that case, we could lower the tax rate and raise government revenue. The same idea is going to apply in our paper. What we're going to say is that the restrictiveness of the rule of origin, what's something called the local content restriction, if it's too high, you won't have much content at all produced within the region. If it's too low, you won't have much content produced within the region. But in between, there will be a maximum. And we don't know what the government's protective preferences are, right? But what we do know is the government doesn't want to have a rule of origin so stringent that it actually lowers the size of the domestic industry. And so it's that counterproductive rule that even if the government is a protectionist in its mindset, it doesn't want to overprotect. And so the way this model works, I don't have time, and it's not the right time to go through the details, but I think we can, if you're familiar with the Concordum, these things will be easy to pick up. If you're not, it'll take more time than we have. So I think what we should just do is show this diagram, or at least focus on this diagram here. And the way I like to think about this diagram is this is the cost of production for a finished, let's say, car, right? And it takes into account all the many inputs that you use in the car. And the idea is that if you have a low rule of origin, it's not going to raise the cost of making the car at all, because you already want to use domestic inputs, because as Esteban said, they're closer to you. The transport costs are lower, and they're advantageous to use those local inputs. But as you increase the rule of origin for plants that don't have good local options, you're going to induce a cost penalty on them. And so let's think about this cost penalty as being heterogeneous. And for a moment, let's just imagine there's 3 types of firms. We'll call them German firms, Japanese firms, and US firms. All right, why? Well, the German firms haven't been in North America very long. Mercedes and BMW have only been in there relatively recently. Their production networks within North America are pretty thin. So as you make them go to more and more North American inputs, their costs rise steeply. And relatively quickly, the penalty they're paying on costs could easily be higher than the tariff that they're facing, which in this case we've drawn as a 10% tariff. At that point, it's no longer worth trying to qualify the rule of origin at all. You'd rather pay the 10% tariff and produce with no cost penalty at all. The Japanese, on the other hand, have been in North America longer. They've set up richer domestic networks, and they're able to qualify more easily, whereas the US firms find it very difficult to qualify. The US firms find it super easy to qualify because their networks have been in North America for 100 years, right, since the beginning. And so they naturally want to produce locally. And so the rule of origin would have to be very, very restrictive for the US firms who want to just throw it out and pay the MFN tariff. Okay, so you can sort of draw for these 3 types of firms, each of their individual Laffer curves, which go up during the period where they're complying with the rule of origin, then drop off when it becomes too expensive, go up, then drop off, go up, and then drop off. Or you can combine all these things together at once and get the Laffer curve that I showed you on the proverbial cocktail napkin before. So here, let's consider the case with all firms. We, at first, as we're getting more and more people that start complying in a constrained way, we're getting an increase in the amount of content done within the region. But eventually, we start to get more and more non-compliers. The share of people that are compliant, unconstrained, is falling monotonically, and the share of people that are non-compliant is rising monotonically. And so eventually you'll get to this peak and start to decline. Now, why don't you get back to the initial 50-50? We drew it 50-50 just because we set up the problem that way, that neither side was intrinsically more costly than the other. Well, there's going to be some firms that just really, really like North America. So they're what we call always compliers. So in this case, it's about 17%. If we get rid of the always compliers, then we will get back to the original starting point. So the key in the model that I've shown up to now is this, compliance, and then people stopping to comply and kicking off. And once they stop to comply, they lower their amount of regional inputs a lot, because there's no longer a gain for them to continue to have that regional input. We didn't consider what happens to the location of assembly. And of course, if you're going to be paying the rule of origin, paying the MFN tariff anyways, when you don't comply with the rule of origin, now the reasons that you originally had for being within the region are diminished. And so some people will simply want to relocate and stop producing within the region. And when we add that possibility of relocating assembly to the model, we now see that things can end up worse than they started. So with no rule of origin, you might have 50% of parts being sourced within the region, but with a very high rule of origin, you could go to considerably lower than that, because some of the assembly is left. And once they leave, if they're back to producing in Germany, they'd rather buy German parts. There's no reason for a German firm to source a lot of North American inputs, or a lot of inputs from Mexico once they decide to relocate production back to Germany. Okay, so that's the model. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the data to give you an idea of where we're going with implementing this possibility illustrated in a continuum, to see how important it is in practice. So the data we have are from a consultancy that tracks where, and when I say where, I mean the latitude and longitude of the plants every engine and transmission come from, that go into every car that's built anywhere in the world. So it's very, very detailed, granular data on these two really important parts that together constitute something like a quarter of the cost of a car. So these are pretty important parts of the car. We know a lot about those engines. Yeah, we know what, for example, if it's a gas or diesel engine. We know the torque of it. We know the horsepower. We know if it's a transmission, how many speeds does it have? Is it manual or is it automatic? So here's a couple interesting facts. First thing, when you're talking about engines, this is an in-house sort of situation. So don't think really about it being two firms negotiating with each other. This is almost always a firm sourcing from internally. This is a little bit less so in the European Union, by the way. When you're thinking about transmissions, it's about 70% in-house in North America, which is still pretty big, only 53% in Europe, but it's lower. So you're more likely to go outside the firm for a transmission. And then related to that, I think, the median distance traveled by an engine is less than 200 kilometers, where the median distance traveled by a transmission is close to 700 kilometers. So these are sort of background facts I think are interesting in their own right and will kind of inform the whole process. All right, so second fact that I think is really interesting, because you often don't have the level of product specification detail that we have to document this fact, which is that there is, if you go to very deep detail, there's single sourcing. Now, if you don't go to deep detail, if you just talk about, say, a Beetle made in Mexico, it will typically source engines from two different factories, and it will typically source transmissions from two different factories. But what it turns out is, if you look closely at those engines and closely at those transmissions, they're different engines. One's a manual, the other's an automatic. One's a gas, the other's a diesel. When you drill down to all the detail that we have, take into account all of this, people single source, which I think is interesting, because we have a lot of stories about why single sourcing might be risky, right? Supply holdups and disruptions and stuff like that, bargaining. And yet these companies have evidently very consistently decide to single source once you go to very, very narrowly defined engines. So one advantage of single sourcing for us technically is that we can use a model of discrete choice, in which for each engine, you're choosing a location I to get that engine, For each transmission, you're choosing a location K to get the transmission. For each finished vehicle going to a market N, you're going to choose a vehicle assembly plant L. So you've got this LIK triple that you're trying to figure out to minimize the overall cost of production, thinking about getting it to that final consumer and market N. Okay, so let's be a little bit more concrete, or stick with this concreteness of the Volkswagen Beetle made in Puebla, Mexico. Now, I tried to get the platform to illustrate for this car. It turns out that platform is kind of old that they use for the Beetle, but the successor platform is called the MQB. So let's just redraw that as the PQ13, which is the platform actually used for the Beetle. Why are these platforms important? Well, the platforms are where the engine and the transmission are sort of plugged in like Lego. And we're going to assume that the platform defines the choice sets for all these discrete choice problems. So that if you're a plant that can make engines for this platform, then you can make engines for any plant that's using that same platform. And finally, if you're when you're thinking about where can we get the car they actually chose to get from Puebla, Mexico, where else might they have gotten it? Well, Chattanooga, Tennessee would be an option because they also make cars on the same platform, PQ13. They make Passats there with the PQ13. Okay, so the platform ends up being our unifying idea that gives us our choice sets. So just to give you further concreteness in the illustration, thinking about this plant in Puebla, Mexico, it actually is sourced from Puebla, Mexico for all the major markets where it sold, right? But it could have been sourced from Chattanooga or Nanjing, China, where both locations where they make Passats, because it's the same platform, or it could have come from Spain or Poland even. Now, what about the engines that it came from? Well, the diesel engines come from Hungary, but they could have come from China. They could have come from Mexico, from the Silao plant. In fact, they get gas plants from the Silao plant, gas engines from the Silao plant. Meanwhile, the manual transmissions come from Barcelona, but they could have come from Shanghai. And the automatics transmissions, would come from one of these two plants in Japan. Okay, so we're now ready to go into the estimation itself. When you go down to this narrow detail, we've got something like 100,000 different vehicle spec choosers. So that's Puebla, Puebla, Mexico, automatic transmission, gas engine, et cetera, with 170 horsepower. And so on average, there's 6 alternatives per engine choice and about 3 alternatives per transmission choice. Overall, something like 7 million observations go into this. But fortunately, there are ways to estimate high dimensional discrete choice problems relatively efficiently. So it doesn't pose a big computational problem. So if you want the references on that, we'll have a paper out soon. Each of these decisions is a multinomial logit decision. And so you're first choosing where to get the transmission, conditional on where you're assembling the car, and where to get the engine, where you're assembling the car. But then when your decision about where to source the final finished vehicle for a given market, you take into account the expected costs of engines and transmissions, conditional on choosing L as your location. So each L potential location site has a different expected cost. So for example, the Puebla might have a relatively low expected cost for engines because there's plenty of engine factories available nearby at relatively low tariffs. But for transmissions, especially automatics, then they have to come from Japan. And so that's going to maybe have a higher expected cost of transmissions. And so we're going to be able to calculate both of these using the coefficients that we estimated at this stage. So let me just show you what kind of results we get. One of the really important things is that we're able to estimate the impact of tariffs on this decision. And the elasticity of choice probability with respect to tariffs is quite large in the area of 7, which means that we've estimated this Eaton-Cortum parameter theta that governs the elasticity of response between different locations as you change tariffs, and it comes in at some of the large numbers that we sort of expect from the literature. We also find huge effects of the NAFTA agreement, which perhaps suggest that the rules of origin are generating very big effects because we've already controlled for the tariff issues. So these have to be the non-tariff effects of NAFTA. All right, we can use this methodology to go back and figure out where are the cheapest places to make engines. The Belgium example is a little bit weird because it's only a few engines involved, but Austria seems to be a great place for engines, and Hungary it seems to be that Austria is great for transmissions and Hungary is great for engines. Okay, then putting those things together, we have those expected log costs of engines and expected log costs of transmissions. And now we also still want to consider tariffs, but at this point we want to consider the tariffs on finished vehicles. So for example, in the US, there's a 2.5% tariff on finished vehicles, unless they're used for hauling goods, like an F-150 pickup truck, in which case it's a 25% tariff on goods, unless they come from within NAFTA. So we're able to estimate that elasticity of substitution, this other theta, the theta at the vehicle level, and it comes in around 4. Again, pretty big, but not as big as the others, which supports the choice structure that we've chosen here. And then we also see significant and important influences for the expected costs of engines and transmissions that we calculated coming out of the previous regression. In fact, these coefficients are so large, they're too large, they imply that the overall cost shares of engines and transmissions sum to something like 100% of the cost of a car instead of 25%, which is what the engineering estimates suggest. So if anything, we're estimating effects that are too big for these things. Then we can also figure out which are the cheapest places to make cars. And the last thing I want to do in the last 2 minutes is think about how we connect the two ideas of the paper, the rules of origin, to the sourcing things we've done so far. So just to go back and fix ideas, think about a Canadian-made Corolla. Now, with the new NAFTA rules of origin brought in by Trump's revision to NAFTA called the USMCA, it's going to be pretty much impossible to qualify for those unless you make the transmission and the engine in North America. So those Japanese-made transmissions that they're currently using will make them no longer qualify. So what do? You can comply, start sourcing the transmissions from the US instead of Japan. You can say the heck with it and just pay the 2.5% MFN duty. Or you might say, if I'm gonna have to pay the MFN at 2.5%, then I might as well go back to producing my Toyotas in Japan. Or what the Canadian tariff negotiators were quite worried about, they thought was a bigger risk, was that you'll just move production to the Georgetown, Kentucky US plants and consolidate production there and say, heck, I'll pay the 6% Canadian tariff on the relatively small fraction of my cars that go back to Canada. So these are all the possibilities that are at work. Now, are they likely to change and switch production? Well, what we can do is we can recover the expected log costs for restricted choice sets. So we can limit the choice set to just North American choices and use the same formula for expected log costs to recalculate it as a restricted choice set to just North American options. And so we do that for every plant, every vehicle, and find out what are the expected log costs of engines and transmissions if they use this restricted choice set that the new NAFTA imposes. And then we're able to say, all right, how big a penalty does that impose on your overall costs? And the answer, sorting from biggest penalties to smallest penalties, is BMW would have an infinite penalty, because for the platforms that BMW uses for its SUVs in Spartanburg, there aren't any engines produced in North America or any transmissions produced in North America for those platforms. So they're going to have to either open up new plants, which is that complicated problem that Esteban's paper was about, or they're going to have to think about not qualifying or moving production back to Germany. For Volkswagen also, the cost penalties are very high, but they do have a North American option for engines. Remember that Silao plant in Mexico that I talked about. And for Daimler, they've got more options, so their costs don't rise quite as much, but they still rise a lot. Whereas the Japanese, which we mentioned, sort of this middle type, they have cost in penalties that are all finite, but are pretty significant, in the area of 10% implied cost penalties, which is larger than the MFN tariffs, right? So they're going to be in a position where they're going to be moving into non-compliance. Whereas for Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, the penalties are very low, and the overall cost penalty is below the 2.5% duty, so they're likely to continue to comply. So we see some evidence from our data of these three types of firms with their differing cost penalties and their presumably differing responses to the higher rules of origin the U.S. have. So what remains is just try and put this more together to give you a more complete picture of whether the USMCA is putting the U.S. on the wrong side of the Laffer rule of origin or not. At this point, we can't say, but there's some, I guess I would say, worrisome evidence that we might go to the wrong side of the rule of origin. Thank you.
Thank you. We have no questions from the audience. So Esteban, go ahead.
Okay, so I had two quick questions. So the first one is, you said something about
Do you want me to show it
so
again?
you're taking the set of plans as given, and then you're calculating, you're doing your estimation condition on these plans, and then you do like you're thinking about potential contrafactual exercises. I just want to understand kind of the timing that you're thinking these applies to, because of course, kind of in the very long run, we want to think about the fact that, the problem that these firms are solving includes the possibility of setting more plants in Mexico or in Canada or etc. And so, there's a bias in some sense of not taking that choice into account. And I want to try to think about how you're thinking about that bias, right? I mean, you're thinking about that bias being very small in the very short run and then kind of growing over time, or how do I think about that missing piece in some sense? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that troubles a lot. We think of it as a medium run exercise. So there's like, the idea is that the sunk cost of establishing a production line, whether it's for engines, transmissions, or vehicles for a particular platform, are pretty big. So we're imagining firms have already paid those sunk costs. They know how to make those platforms. And so that within that platform constraint, they can switch where they do things and retool a plant as long as it's the same platform, because the big sunk costs are for that platform. And so it's kind of a medium. It's not the short run where you can't change anything, but it's not the long run where you can actually add new plants. One idea we had for the long run, I don't know what you think of it, is to allow for the possibility that any factory that makes vehicles could vertically expand back into engines or transmissions, if that company makes engines and transmissions, which most of them do someplace. And so then allow as an option that Spartanburg plant would add an engine factory. Because if we don't constrain it somewhat, the choice is we end up in your world, right? And in your world with densities for these things, these are big, large things. I don't know if that's the way we would want to end up.
Right. I mean, the other thing I was thinking is, if you see kind of the frequency at which new plants are created and things like that, you could say, well, I know that, in some sense, the optimization on the number of plants, where do we put plants and the number of plants, is not something that is being decided at a very high frequency. And so that allows me to kind of bound the bias in some sense that comes from firms actually having that extra margin, right? So if I only see that firms create new plants every 10 years, then, then I'm less worried. If I see firms creating new plants every year, then I'm much more worried. right? And whether there's kind of like a formal way of thinking about that, bounding that would be interesting. And just one quick more. So you said, well, they're sourcing from one particular place, right? So they're sourcing transmissions from one particular plant, and you're saying, well, and you said something about, well, this whole resilience question, in some sense, well, doesn't seem to, it doesn't seem that they're doing anything about it because they seem to be doing this sourcing. But what I was thinking is, well, but if I have different plants sourcing from different places, even if it's only one, then over time I may be switching, right? I don't have to source from many places at the same time, but I may have many potential places from which I can source that other of my plants are sourcing from, and then switch if I need to. So if, the tsunami comes and destroys one plant, then I know that some of my other plants are sourcing from some other, and yes, it's a little bit more costly for a particular plant, but they always have that option to do it. So that provides resilience over time, even though in a particular point in time, I'm only always sourcing from one, right?
That's right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the same answer to that question applies to look at some data about how frequently they do change and how fast those changes take place, right? So I think we can, by using some of that frequency data, because we've got 20, close to 20 years of data, so we can sort of answer some of those questions. And I think they both rely on the same sort of investigation. So thank you. Those are really great suggestions. Really appreciate that.
There is a question from the audience by Somesh Mathur. Why is NAFTA free trade area not capturing tariff liberalization, and why? I'm not sure that I'm understanding that question.
So I think maybe the question is sort of why did the rule of origin move to be more restrictive, which makes NAFTA less of a free trade agreement area. And I think that the reason is to try to spur more production in North America. That's explicitly what Lighthizer says. So Lighthizer believed that this would move more production in North America, and particularly into the US. And that's part of why part of the rules of origin involved labor value contents that said that a car, even if it was made with 75% NAFTA parts, would have an additional requirement that 45% it would have to come from high wage factories, $16 or more, that Mexican factories wouldn't fit. So there was a clear protective motive involved. I mean, acknowledge, it's not sort of my view, is that's what they said they wanted to do.
If there are no more questions, I'm the next, and I'm sharing my screen. So this is joint work with Sebastian Dörr from the Bank for International Settlement, Davide Suverato from Technical University in Zurich, and Thierry Verdier from Paris School of Economics. So the trade view of multi-product firms is that multi-product firms are more productive compared to single product firms, and they dominate in international trade. So the multi-product firms account for 60% of exporters, 98% of export value, and above 90% of US manufacturing sales. So the finance view of multi-product firms is different. They call multi-product firms conglomerates, and they claim that conglomerates trade at a discount. They call it the conglomerate discount. So what does that mean? It means that conglomerates have lower Tobin skew compared to single segment firms. So the view is that internal capital markets in multi-product firms lead to misallocation of capital across divisions. And that's the reason why we observe a conglomerate discount. So the question we raise is, how can we reconcile the productivity enhancing view of multi-product firms of the trade literature with the efficiency destroying view of conglomerates in the finance literature. So before I go to give an answer, I want to give you some motivating facts, and we are using data by WorldScope from publicly listed US firms in manufacturing between 1997 and 2014, and that includes balance sheet information and accounting information on SIC 4-digit level business segments. And we have 3,341 firms with about 1,089 exporters and 740 multi-segment firms. So the facts I'm going to show are with this data. So what are the facts? This figure shows the conglomerate discount for exporters, for multi-product exporters, which is the blue line, and the conglomerate discount of non-exporters, which is the dotted black line. And the conglomerate discount is the Tobin skew of a multi-segment firm relative to the Tobin skew of a single segment firm. So if these two types of firms have the same Tobin skew, we will get a ratio of 1. But as you can see in the figure, the ratio is below 1. So we established the fact that the finance literature has established that multi-product firms traded at the conglomerate discount. But we also see the striking feature that exporters have a smaller conglomerate discount than non-exporters. The blue line is above the black dotted line. And moreover, the conglomerate discount turned to a conglomerate premium after the financial crisis of 2008 in exporters, while it increased for domestic firms. So the question is, why do firms exposed to international trade suffer from a smaller conglomerate discount? So what we do is we introduce an internal capital market in which managers compete for funds into a two-factor model of multi-product firms with monopolistic competition to explain which product firms finance and produce. We microfound the theory of multi-product firms in a finance theory of organization. So what are our findings? So the first finding is that conglomerates trade at a discount because the internal competition for funds, this is the internal capital market, over-allocates capital to the best segments of the firm. This is one result we get. The second result we get is that international trade imposes discipline on the competition for capital within firms, and by doing so, it improves the efficiency of the internal capital market. And this is the reason why the conglomerate discount is smaller for trading firms. And then we use China's entry into the WTO to show that import competition improves the within firm misallocation of capital in publicly listed US firms. So our paper contributes to the corporate finance literature. In a seminal paper by Jeremy Stein, he said that internal capital markets are efficient. The firm engages in winner picking, and the funds go to the most productive projects within the firm. However, a couple of years later, Rajan et al. And Schaffstein and Stein, they said internal capital markets can be inefficient. Funds go to the weakest segments of the firm at the expense of the good segments. So internal capital markets lead to corporate socialism. So our model incorporates both features and explains why the recent finance literature finds mixed empirical evidence on the efficiency of internal capital markets. So whether a firm will have a conglomerate discount or a conglomerate premium will depend on the trade environment that this firm faces. We also make a contribution to the misallocation literature. The misallocation literature said that differences in the efficiency of capital allocation in a sector, they call it misallocation between firms, explains differences in total factor productivity across countries. However, in a recent paper by Carrick and Vincent, they show that 2/3 of the misallocation of capital originates within firms rather than between firms. So what we offer in this paper is a novel theory of misallocation within firms, which we show is reduced by more international competition. So I'm coming to the model. So what we have a trade model with heterogeneous multi-product firms with monopolistic competition along the lines of Meyer, Melitz, and Ottaviano 2014. And we introduce new elements to this model. First, capital as a second factor of production. There is going to be asymmetric information between the owner of a firm who allocates the capital and division managers. And managers are going to compete for capital. I cannot walk you through the model because I don't have enough time. But those of you who know the multi-product literature, they know what I'm talking about. And those who don't know, I cannot explain it in the short time. So what I'm going to do is now, I move directly to the new elements that we introduce into this model. And we are going to look at each of these inside of these multi-product firms, which consists of an owner and divisional managers running the division of each of the firm's products. So we have multi-product firms, they produce several products, and each of these products have a manager that runs the division for this product. So now, how is the internal capital market in these firms organized? So we are assuming an informational friction. The firm cannot verify the true cost of a non-core division, XI, in a firm. And this is because this is private knowledge of the division manager only. So only the division manager knows his ability of running the division with certain costs. The firm only knows the cost of the core division with which it is familiar, but it needs to hire a manager who runs the firm for the second, runs the product for the division for the product of this, for the second product. And that is not, and that the cost of this division is not known to the firm. Then we are assuming that managers are empire builders. They strategically over-report the true cost of their division. The true cost of the division is XI, and the reported cost, the cost that they report is ZI, and MUI is the misreporting factor. And they do over-report the true cost to maximize their private benefits from running a bigger division. So they pretend to be less efficient than they really are in order to get more capital to run a bigger division. And then we have the firm itself engages in winner picking. It ranks the managers by the divisional return on investment and decides then which of these managers will be getting employed. Then we have the empire building managers. So the actual production in the firm is not in this segment, in the non-core segment, is not verifiable by the firm. Only the amount of output that is sold on the market. And managers receive a private benefit from producing more than is sold on the market. So the private benefit is maybe the future chances. If they run bigger divisions, they have better future chances to getting a job in the next firm. So they have a private benefit, which is not pecuniary. It's not compensated by a wage. And this private benefit B is a function of this excess production. And as you see in this private benefit function that is given here, it's also a function of this misreporting factor mu. I will talk more about this. Now I'm coming to the competition for funds inside the firm. So the firm is opens and tournament among candidate managers for running non-core divisions. And the managers announce their customization costs simultaneously and without coordination. The firm then ranks the managers by return on assets given the announced costs of the managers. And when the manager decides on the reported customization cost, he knows the core competence cost of the firm, C. He knows the market cutoff CD. What is the market cutoff CD? This is the cost level at which the firm can survive, barely can survive in the market. And CD is a sufficient statistic to describe the amount of competition in the market. So the manager knows CD, and the manager knows the number of divisions a firm is going to open. And then managers choose the factor of misreporting, which maximizes their expected payoff. So when you look at this equation for the misreporting factor mu I that maximizes the benefit of the private benefit of the manager, you see this capital gamma, which is the probability of getting funding. So basically, the manager wants to over-report as much as possible. But if he over-reports too much, he's in competition with other managers for funding. And if he over-reports too much, he runs the risk of not getting funded. He knows the distribution of the costs of his competitive managers. So he cannot over-report too much, otherwise he's not getting any funding. So that brings me to our proposition. So basically what we show is that the solution for this over-reporting factor exists and is unique. And what we show is that only managers with products that are sufficiently good, that are have sufficiently large, small marginal cost, apply for funds, and they over-report the customization costs, meaning that mu I is going to be larger than 1. And then what we do is we run comparative statics with respect to this over-reporting factor mu I. And here I give you four comparative statics, and I want to walk you through this. So the first comparative static says that over-reporting is larger the lower the marginal cost. Why is that? The reason is that only managers with relatively good products with low marginal cost have the room for over-reporting and still face a positive probability of being financed. So if you are in the firm and you are one of the best managers, you know you can over-report and still give a competitive offer in terms of cost compared to your competitive candidate managers, because you know you are among the best managers. So the over-reporting takes place in the best segments most, and in the best firms with the lowest core competence cost also most. The second comparative statistic is that the over-reporting factor is an increasing function of CD. So that means that over-reporting is lower, the tougher is competition in the output market. So that's basically telling you that trade acts as a disciplining device on the competition for capital within multi-product firms. So the intuition is here the following. Tougher competition lowers the cost level at which firms can survive in the market. And managers use that cut-off cost level as a benchmark when they decide by how much they are going to deviate from the true cost. And by this, so they are going to, when CD is lower and competition is tougher, they are going to over-report less and less, because otherwise they are not going to get financing. Because the segment cannot survive in the market. So trade acts as a disciplining device. And the last comparative statistic says that the over-reporting factor is larger in firms with more divisions. And the reason is the following. When the firm offers more slots to be filled, it is more likely that the manager's offer will be in the range of selected offers. So therefore, managers do not care about the position they are going to be ranked in the tournament. They only care to be in the pool of offers to be financed. So therefore, managers have less of an incentive to make lower offers of ZI. Actually, we show in the empirics that this is actually the case, that firms with more divisions, I'm not showing this result, but we have it in the paper, that firms with more divisions have larger marginal costs. So I'm coming now, taking the theory to the data. So what we do is actually we derive structural equations from the model, which we then test. And what I'm going to show you here is only the prediction from these structural equations. So the first prediction is that the relationship between the marginal cost of a segment and the allocation of capital is inversely U-shaped. It looks like this. On the horizontal axis, you have the segment's marginal cost. As you move to the right, the marginal cost increase. On the vertical axis, you have the allocation of assets and the relationship between the allocation of capital and the segment's marginal cost is inversely U-shaped. So there are two opposing forces at work. The first is that segments with larger marginal costs require more capital to produce because they have larger costs. So this is the technology effect. And managers over-report the costs more because in the best segments, they over-report more. That was the result of proposition 1. But then segments with larger marginal costs, they charge larger prices and therefore face less demand. And that's the demand effect. Therefore, they produce less. Therefore, they need less capital. And over-reporting starts to decline at the segments with larger marginal costs because they have a lower probability of being funded. So that's why you see this inversely U-shaped relationship. At low marginal cost, the capital allocation rises. At high marginal costs, the capital allocation declines with higher marginal costs. I'm skipping this. So I'm coming now to check how competition is going to affect the within firm misallocation. And let me show you first a non-parametric test of the disciplining effect of China. So here, this figure gives the conglomerate discount, the blue the blue line gives the conglomerate discount for sectors which face high competition from China. And the dotted line gives the conglomerate discount for sectors which face low competition from China. So as you see, the industries with high competition from China have lower conglomerate discount, and the discount declines over time, while the discount in the sectors which face little competition, the discount remains basically constant. So let me now test this in a more rigorous way. The first prediction we get is that an increase in import competition reduces the reported marginal cost in the best segments. Over-reporting is in the best segments. And this will be the case, and this is a condition we derive, if the elasticity of the over-reporting factor mu with respect to CD is greater than 1. The second prediction is that an increase in import competition increases the allocation of capital to the best segments if the demand effect dominates the over-reporting effect. And the third prediction is that both effects are going to be more pronounced in firms with more informational friction. So we are going to measure informational friction in the firm by the tenure of the CEO in the board, the top CEO guy in the board. The shorter his tenure, the less likely it is that he knows the cost of a division, and therefore the more likely it is that the division is going to over-report. So let's look at the data. So the first 3 columns look at the change in the relative marginal costs. The column from 4 to 6 looks at the change in assets, capital assets. And we are interested in the interaction term. And so the interaction term between efficient segments. Efficient segment here means that these are the best segments of the firm, the 2 best segments of the firm, the 2 best, the segments with the lowest cost. And so in column 1, you see clearly that in these segments, the China shock reduces the marginal costs. And then in column 3, you see, we look at the firm with high informational friction, in which the CEO tenure is only short, and there the negative effect is even stronger. And then we look at the assets, and we see that the China shock leads to a reallocation of assets to the best segments. The coefficient is positive, and the column 6 shows that this effect is much stronger in firms in which there is a high information friction. So let me end here. I'm just looking whether we have questions. Do you see any questions in the chat? I don't see the chat. Oh, okay. Here's the chat. I'm not sure whether I understand. So there is a question by Shomesh Mathur, the same person that asked the first question. Sorry, it disappeared again. Sorry, I can't read the question.
Dalia?
Question says, no cost of higher inventory for the overproduction at the division. So it asks whether you are modeling that there's higher inventory cost if a division overproduces.
No, whether yes. So this is not taking into account that there are inventory costs for that, but in some way, it's really not whether the firm overproduces, but it just employs more people and runs bigger divisions without really increasing the output. So yes, but we don't take inventory costs into account. That's true.
I have a quick question. So you emphasize trade, and obviously trade can be a source of competition for some of these divisions, but of course there's all sorts of other trends in terms of that are industrial trends in terms of concentration in the industry, new technologies, etc., that can lead to more competition without trade, right? So there's nothing particular about trade, right? I mean, it's all about competition and competition in the market of the particular division, if I understood your theory correctly. And so I guess the question is so when we compare the trade versus non-trade set of firms or set of divisions, I guess, to what extent are we kind of assuming that there's no more competition in some of those industries where there very much could be more competition through, like I said, changes in technology or entry of new firms or etc. So, you know, how do...
Yeah. So in fact, actually, it could also be domestic competition. It's the same, actually. Domestic competition, it's just that obviously firms that are exposed to international competition face more competition than domestic firms. Otherwise,
that's the part that I guess is not so clear to me. In particular, what's not so clear to me is why do we assume that the trend in the extent of that competition is kind of to more competition over time for the exporters, but no more competition over time for the domestic firms. I mean, I can also think about entry at the local level, at the city level, etc., where we're seeing, you know, firms expand and compete in local markets, things like that lead to more competition for firms that are not exporting. They provide, for example, local services.
Yes, but I mean, this is the China shock. So this is a competition shock that goes beyond any other competition shock a firm can face, the competition shock from China. For those firms that, I mean, we are looking at firms here that face a competition shock above the median of competition from China. So this is really firms that are exposed to tough competition. I assume that firms that in the domestic market don't face the same type of competition. Even firms that have below Chinese competition, a bit below competition of below median Chinese competition, don't face the same kind of conglomerate discount than the one that face big competition. So it's really the degree of competition that is captured here. And assuming that domestic firms did not face the same kind of competition shock than those exposed. We are looking at the interaction, Davide Cantone, we are looking at the interaction effect being multi-segment times being exporter, being in a sector highly affected. No, we are looking at the interaction effect of being a multi-segment firm times highly affected by Chinese competition. It's not conditioned to being an exporter.
I think Andrea wants us to wrap up.
Oh, okay. So we wrap up. Thank you for the three contributions, and I hope to see you soon personally.
Thank you for organizing, Dalia.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. Bye-bye.
Bye.